complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messing
Just a quick introduction before I bring my guest on. I've been really fascinated with the concept of psychology for a long time, both as sort of a form of modern religion, and then also simply the fact that we are in the middle of, what some have called a mental health crisis. So, regardless of your opinion on the matter, it is something in the discourse, it is being discussed. And I could think of few people better to discuss that and the philosophical undertones than Athenian stranger. But before we jump in, quick word from our sponsor. All right, Athenian stranger, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Doing great, my friend. Thank you so much for having me back on again. I always love whenever I get a chance for us to catch up and for us to talk about these things.
Definitely. I think that I enjoy doing recurring guests, right? Especially if there's a rapport, if there's someone worth talking to many times. And I think that there's always the danger almost of doing that too much. But our past two conversations have been so good, I sort of couldn't help myself, and I'm really looking forward to having you on.
Yeah,
So, as far as our topic for today, as I sort of teased before, we're going to be talking about the self, right? And how that's sort of a very important idea to understand. So, do you want to sort of set out our terms and then launch in from there?
sure. So this topic of the self, what is the self, is something that I've been fascinated in for a very long time because there's one way that there is a way in which you can understand the entirety of the Western philosophical tradition as this inquiry into what is the self, because one of Plato's Socrates' famous claims is that philosophy is the pursuit of self-knowledge, and what happens to that pursuit changes in the boundaries or the limitations are discerned by later philosophers all the way to the point of post-modernity with the rise of the so-called subconscious, where now the possibility of even self-knowledge is so limited that one wonders if there even is a self. And so what has happened beginning in early modernity and to our day now is there's been a very powerful movement of a denial of the self. Now, okay, that's a lot of fancy philosophical nerd kind of stuff. Athenian, tell us why this is important, because uh, what's going on in the world today is simply undeniable with these issues of mental health, and everyone either is themselves, right? See, we even use that word self so casually, or they know someone who is probably on antidepressants or anti-anxiety kind of things. And so an understanding of what we even mean when we say the self is important, because that's the way that the various psychologists or psychiatrists are treating people that come to see them. So it would certainly be beneficial for us to have a kind of understanding of the self, or at least have some background knowledge of it, simply because it is so extremely important in the, I guess, the mental well-being of either ourselves or the people close to us that we love, that we hate to see them have to go through uh, these kinds of things. I mean, it's a sort of a running meme that everyone is. So many people are like on, like I said, antidepressants, anti-anxieties, and we find that comical and funny because it's true to a certain extent. Uh, but how do we go about fixing this? Well, one way is to just become better consumers. better consumers of ourselves, right? And so again, just got to come back around to what is even meant by the self, and how has it become problematic? What has happened to make this thing we call the self so problematic or frustrating in some ways? So that's probably how I would pitch it. And I know that it's like a kind of a lot of fancy word salad and stuff, but I think it's one of those endless topics that people really enjoy, because we all, for instance, talk to ourselves, right? I mean, that's how we spend our days. Like, ah, I can't believe I did that. Something like that. We're talking to ourselves. So, okay, all right, cool. What does this mean? What comes tumbling out of this? And so that's what we'll find in this discussion.
I think that that's a point to hammer on, right? One might be tempted to say, "Oh, this is completely theoretical. Why does this matter?" Uh, but I think it's very clear that there is a breakdown, right? That people do not know how to deal with themselves. Again, to just keep using that word over and over again. Conservatives are kind of one to point and laugh at Zoomers on TikTok with these bizarre invented personal pronouns, and certainly those people are worthy of mockery, right? They're ridiculous people. But if we sort of look at the claim being made there, right, it is very clearly a complete and total lack of any real identity, right? Any sense of self in particular. And so I think to merely point at the ridiculous and laugh and go no further is a mistake. So you sent me some notes before we started recording rather. And one of the first things you mentioned is what Plato defines the purpose or the end of philosophy is. So do you want to jump into that and explain what you meant?
Yeah. So what the audience should know, and this is funny, is we were we were talking about various Platonic dialogues that we might discuss. Because see, that's first of all is anytime you have a topic at hand, uh, we say, okay, we kind of want to know a history of it. So when did it first pop onto the horizon? And that itself, right? I mean, it's funny, we can't avoid that word itself. Uh, that itself is a very deep question. When does the self arise onto the scene? And it would seem to be the case, at least linguistically, that this really happens with Plato. Now, we got to keep in mind, though, Homer's Odysseus is always talking to himself, but it says that he speaks to his heart, though. So he's speaking to his heart, but still, same concept. But we we were going back and forth on different Platonic dialogues, and Jay Burden was mentioning like the Parmenides, and I was like, "Oh my God, hold on, that's a tough one, man." The
To sort of pull the curtain back even further, I had mentioned that, and then I sent you a message roughly 24 hours later. I was like, all right, we got to pull that. I have been way over my head.
yeah,
So it's a very professional show here, not that you know.
I know that the Plato's Parmenides is understood to be just about the most difficult of all the dialogues, outside of, for instance, the Sophist or something like that. But I had mentioned to him, I said, well, let's kind of step back here for a minute, because there's another dialogue called the Alcibiades one. There's two dialogues called the Alcibiades. There's the first and the second. And in the first, what it is Plato's Socrates. It's an account of Plato's Socrates for the first time that he ever talks to Alcibiades. And what's so significant about this is Alcibiades was the greatest statesman for all of classical Athens, as far as raw natural talent. Um, it's just, and so it's what you have is the philosopher approaching the politician, right? The would-be politician who has all this potential for greatness. And what's going to happen, right? Because the thing about philosophy is there's really only one way to, it's like ethics, and this is what Aristotle says in the Ethics. The thing about the good is that there's only one way to hit it, but there's an infinite number of ways to miss it, right? You can go wrong. And that's what makes philosophy so dangerous, is that you're trafficking in these very fundamental questions, and one slip up from the professor or the teacher has enormous consequences for the life of the student. We're seeing that play itself out in academia. But what we get in the Alcibiades one is literally the discovery of the self. Socrates brings up the fact that the inscription at the Oracle of Delphi, which is sort of what we would think of as the most authoritative of all the sacred shrines in classical Athens. It says, the inscription says, to know thyself. And Plato's Socrates is famously going to say in the Apology that that's what he understands philosophy as knowing oneself. Well, that presumes that you know what is the self, right? And in this discussion with Alcibiades, it turns out that he quite literally says we have to find out how to discover the self, right? How do we discover the self? And now, just to sort of step back here for a moment, because again, I want to make sure your listeners know that this is not this deep philosophical discussion that doesn't have any skin in the game for us, if we're not necessarily wanting to read Plato or anything. So I'll give a spoiler here. Is what's going to happen is that the imagery that arises as a result of this so-called discovery of the self by Plato Socrates with Alcibiades gets sharpened and really focused in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics into nothing less, and this is what's so amazing about it, than the entirety of the meaning of friendship for the good life in Aristotle. So what I mean by that is Aristotle is going to point out, he's going to use this imagery, this amazing imagery of the friend in the truest sense, right? In other words, if we don't use that word casually and we actually have content to it, if we're serious about what we mean by friends, a friend is a second self. And so it's the fact that the friend is a second self, and everything that's involved in that second self helping us to see the elements of our own self that we don't quite see because we might have limited vision or something like that with regard to this ourselves, that's going to constitute the friendships in the good. And so again, I know this sounds all kind of fancy and technical, but let's think about what's being said here. Plato's Socrates is telling us that this thing we call philosophy, whatever it is somehow deeply, deeply involved in discovering ourself, whatever our self is. And Aristotle, and this is also going to be this aspect of friendship is also going to be involved in the Alcibiades, that Platonic dialogue. But uh, Aristotle is going to use that and say, you know what? This is why having friends is so absolutely important, not so much in philosophy, although it is, but most especially in this thing that we call the good life, the life that one would pray for. I mean, that's literally the language that Aristotle uses, is that the good life consists in the things that one would pray for to spend the rest of one's life doing. And so that's where I think there's this incredible tangency, uh, contact with what we can all immediately relate to, right? Is once you begin to think of the fact that uh, our our friends, I mean, they make our lives, they enrich our lives so much. Once you begin to think of the friends and the company you keep as versions of a second self of you, that's when those friendships can gain a whole deeper level of meaning, because that's the kind of thing where you grow together. Because if you understand someone to be a kind of doubling of yourself, well, then in times that are rough or hard times, you'll be able to gain insight from them to help you through them, right? Because they're kind of a doublet of you, if you have chosen wisely. And that's the whole point, though, is that to know yourself is to be able to choose your friends even better than you might otherwise do. So this gets back to the old saying, the adage, like attracts like. Can't really explain it, but that we just somehow came together, whether it's intimate between a man and a woman and sharing their lives together, or whether it's just between two guys who, you know what, we just click, man. We just knew we were going to be great friends. That's everything that's going to come tumbling out of all this is putting a kind of description to what is meant when we say like attracts like. Well, it's because you found a second self, right? That's why like attracts like, because you both have the same kind of understanding of this pursuit of the good life. And I mean, I think I don't even have to say this for your readers or anything, but this has enormous significance for those of faith, because this is very similar to what we find, for instance, in the New Testament, where it said, you simply you can't lie with dogs, right? And not get fleas or something like that. And so that's why we need to be so discerning in the company that we keep, the friends we have. So again, all of this comes tumbling out. And see, uh, in saying all of that, you realize immediately, well, wait a minute, uh, this could have great import, where I wouldn't necessarily have to, go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist because, life is tough and I'm having a hard time getting through these, dark days. Um, Maybe you don't need a prescription for any kind of antidepressant. Maybe what you really need is a way to know how to just simply find better friends, second selves, right? uh, because not only can they help you through the hard times, but they help you through the good times by being, uh, as Aristotle is going to say, uh, and this is the imagery that Plato's Socrates is going to use in the Alcibiades, is that you look into the eyes of someone else, and he's going to use the imagery of the eye of the soul. And let's remember, psychology etymologically means a logos of the soul. In other words, to give an account of the soul. And the imagery being used is that the eye of the soul is what the second self sees you with, to help you see the blind spots that your own eye in the soul cannot see. In the same way that we have limited vision with our physical eyes, we might also have limited vision with the eye of the soul. And so our friends help us find these things. And so in good times, in the pursuit of the good together as good friends, uh, they're able to help you see the things about yourself that you might not be able to see, and say, hey, if you could clarify this a little bit with your own sight, you could even be better, right? And so that one could say that that's even the significance of the imagery of iron sharpens iron, right? Uh, so again, the like attracts like, right? Iron and iron, but then also the fact that you help each other see things about each other that you don't necessarily see, but once aware of them, you become better, because you can't solve a problem if you don't know what the problem is. And this is what friends help us do. It. So again, uh, you know, might not necessarily be that need for the absolutely and by far most prescribed medications in all of the West. Big pharma loves for us to continue to be depressed, to be ridden and riddled with anxiety. But if we take seriously some of these old books that have so much to say about these things, we might not necessarily have to go down this or continue down this road of a kind of pathological consumption of big pharma's, you know, mental drugs and things like that.
So there's several things I want to jump into there. Bring up this concept of friendship as a sort of a reflection of another self. And in fact, this whole conversation, generally speaking, is based off of a conversation I had with a group of friends about C.S. Lewis's book Till We Have Faces, which is sort of his retelling of the Cupid and Psyche myth. That word psyche, right, we'll come back to. And it's funny, I'm not much of a Lewis guy. I like some of his work, I don't like others. But he has a quote, or it's part of a larger aphorism, when he basically says, friendship is looking at someone else and saying, "Oh, you too," right? That reflection of the self. And we as moderns have a real problem with friendship, right? You can look into the actual data here. I don't have it at hand, but a lot of people have almost no friends, outside of their immediate coworkers. And not only do they lack friends, right? Do they sort of exist in isolated, atomized way, but it becomes very difficult for them to look back into the past and understand friendship outside of kind of a cynical, kind of Freudian lens, right? So you see this as a more recent example with Lord of the Rings, for instance. So Sam and Frodo, they couldn't have been friends; they must have been lovers. You see this in the ancient world as well with someone like Sappho, right? In the ancient world, writing a friend of yours a letter, extolling their virtues was something common, relatively speaking, commonly done, right? This was the encomium, right? This is how great your breeding is, how great any number of things about you are. And we can't look at that as, that people at the time would have. It is read entirely through that kind of like cheap lens of Freudian sexuality. And again, I think it's interesting because not only do we sort of have that misreading, but we lose the kind of, and I'm struggling for words here, but sort of the multifaceted nature of friendship. Because when you look at a man like Nietzsche, the way he described friendship, this kind of like masculine friendship of extreme competition, it's something that is entirely outside the scope of this kind of like therapy based, psychology driven state religion. So I've thrown a lot at you there, Athenian stranger. Is there anything you want to pick at?
Yeah, well, so this is very fascinating. This so in our discussion of the self, uh, and what it is, we have discovered the role of friendship in the good life, uh, and the question of what the good life is and how to go about living it. That's the fundamental Socratic question. That's what Socrates is. That's the only question he's concerned with, and from that question, all of philosophy, according to Plato, and I would argue much of Aristotle and Xenophon, comes tumbling out. Now, so if you keep that in mind, what you find is that when you get to modernity, all the way up to us today, friendship has somehow disappeared as a concept for the study of philosophy or something. And so it's not one students today would never even come across how important it is to be able to add content to what we even mean when we say friends, because it's not taught anymore. Why did that happen? Right? What's gone wrong? How did friendship disappear from all of these things? And I mean, there's a number of reasons for this, but what you point out, for instance, with Nietzsche's the one who brings it back. Now he brings it back in a very competitive sort of way, because he's aiming for people to become stronger, because he's diagnosed Western man as having become weak, spiritually, masculine. Everything is just weak. And one could say, or make a very good case, that the reason Nietzsche had to diagnose us as spiritually weak, as just effeminate, is precisely because a robust understanding of friendship had disappeared from the tradition. Nietzsche says in one of his prefaces, it's to the Human All Too Human, that he says, "When I needed friends the most, I didn't have them, and so I had to create them." And that's essentially what he's saying. What his books are, is they're the creation of his friends that he needed, but he didn't have. We would understand that today as this thing called alienation. How is it that what has happened uh, in the wake of modernity and with the absence of any serious teachings about friendship, man becomes alienated, alienated in society. We see this with the kind of existential literature that arises, in the late 19th and early 20th century. There's a famous book called essentially "The Man in the Gray Suit." In other words, the businessman. Today's businessman. He's just a man in a gray suit. They're all gray suits. There's everything is like tapioca. Everything is mediocrity. But if we had not lost track of this concept of friendship as being an absolutely crucial element to the good life, then we might not have had to go down this road. But that doesn't have to be a black pill, as we say, because it could be something as simple as saying, you know what, it's not over, right? John Rambo, nothing is over. I mean, just how about we pick up what's been left behind and take seriously this concept of friendship now? Because again, what comes along with this deep understanding of friendship is the deep understanding of the self, right? Because that's where friendship came from, was this understanding of the self. Um, so there's all that, but we also have to realize this is the element that I left out, because I raised the question, but I didn't answer it. What has happened, right? How have these things disappeared, for instance, in modernity? Well, that brings us to the modern practice, for instance, of psychiatry or psychology. That's why they end up being far more destructive than helpful. They're only helpful insofar as they're able to prescribe medications that simply punt the problem away. But people don't get healed through therapy or anything like that with a psychiatrist or psychologist, because they're only meeting like once a week or something like that for an hour. When Freud was practicing, he would not even take clients unless they could meet with him for at least a few hours every day of the week, or at least 4 or 5 days a week. That's because he knew that's how you could really get to know someone. But we've reduced even that to a kind of drive-through window version of things. So as bad as Freud was ultimately with reducing everything to sex, we've managed to find a lower level that. But this is the point. What has happened uh, that has caused the self to disappear, which has also had the consequence of friendship disappearing, is that we get in early modernity very, very thin, very weak uh, presentations of what the self is. So, for instance, John Locke famously has a very, very weak understanding of the self, where in many ways he's almost denying the self. Because, and think of it this way, and this is because David Hume is going to pick it up. Hume is going to be the one who really seals the deal. Hume's going to flatly deny that there is such thing as a self. And then philosophy from then on, which has already essentially become just epistemology, which is theories of knowledge, which is really all that things like schools of pedagogy for teachers and psychology itself has become. Hume is going to deny that there is a self. And the denial of the self that we live in the wake of, the shadow of today, and especially with the rise of all these various theories of the unconscious, which is to say, theories of the self that you have no control over, you have no volition over these things. What it is that it rests on the following kind of argument. There are we all have perceptions throughout time of how we think of ourselves, right? But what Hume is going to argue, and this is going to, and this is really what Locke is getting at as well, and it's going to be the whole tradition, is that yes, we have these changing understandings of ourself, but there's nothing that links them together, right? There's no unifying principle that links them together. So what man is, and this is effectively what Nietzsche is going to say the self is just these various competing drives that one day something wins, one particular drive wins, whereas another day a different particular drive wins. And so, yeah, you're not the same person you were yesterday, but that's only because there's really no such thing as a person. You yourself is just a kind of a chaos. And one way to think of it is this. What's being said here is the following. In the pre-modern understanding, which is to say, for instance, Plato, Aristotle, and of course, the Christian tradition, uh, what we understand as the self or the soul is a principle of anti-entropy, right? In other words, whatever it is, this thing is we call the soul, it is what unifies us and makes us a whole, right? A stable whole. And it's precisely that that gets denied with the various different claims to epistemology or theories of how it is that we even learn in modernity. And so, if the way it is that we learn is just merely these kind of sense perceptions, sense data, uh, then it's going to be very hard to have any kind of principle of unity to all these things. The self is going to be nothing more than this thing that collates information on a constant basis, and that's it. There's not a kind of unifying principle to any of it, and it's only after no one can come to any agreement except for the fact that there is no self that all of a sudden these claims of the theories of the unconscious all of a sudden step in, and it's sorry, allergies out here. It's going to be
Oh,
those theories of the unconscious that now become the unifying principle. So there is going to be a self. It is going to have a unifying principle, but we have no control over it, right? It's unconscious. It's trauma from your early life that you don't even remember, that affects you in various ways, and so that's where it just adds to this more of this problem of the anxiety of man today, who's always looking for explanations, doesn't know how to find them. Someone says, well, it's because of your early life, so you are in fact, and you can be a victim. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. Well, hold on a minute. Let's have a more robust understanding of responsibility. This is what Scripture teaches. This is certainly what the pre-moderns taught. So a kind of return to that, I think, is extremely beneficial.
so there's a lot to go into there. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting about that, that idea of sort of being driven by a collection of different, effectively morally neutral urges, right? And that is sort of the thing that determines the direction you take. Is that you see a lot of this in, and I don't have a better term for this, but effectively therapy culture. And one of the reasons this is an issue that I'm really interested in is that it's roughly 1 in 5 millennials has been diagnosed with a psychological disorder by a mental health professional. I don't know what the numbers for Gen Z are, but I would imagine they are higher than that just based off my personal experience. And so what you see is that this sort of thinking is endemic. It's everywhere. You can't get away from it. And there are a couple of things buried in that, right? So the idea of the traumatic childhood, right? There's several things to point out there, which is one, it sort of breaks that chain of filial piety, right? There's one. But also it's the idea that the things wrong with your life are out of your control. So thinkers like E. Michael Jones and Younger actually talk about therapy, right? Sitting on the couch as sort of an inversion of that ritual of confession. right? And yet, instead of go and sin no more, right, as the priest might tell you, it is, well, your dad was mean to you. You had a traumatic childhood. And really, what you want to do, there's nothing wrong with that to begin with. It's sort of a managing of symptoms. And to me, I think that that's very interesting, because if we look at this in a broader perspective, it is effectively, what Nietzsche would describe as resentment, right? You are virtuous because you are weak, because there is something wrong with you. And I think that's really interesting, to take something that was identified as a threat in culture quite a long time ago and literally turn that into a ritual, right? And you mentioned, right, how Freud, believed in these hour-long sessions, right, day after day after day. And I was talking with my wife about this, and she actually mentioned how sad it is to basically pay someone an hourly rate to listen to you talk about your life. Just like any philosophy aside, that's a really sad thing to do, to basically hire a friend. And I think that it's an interesting thing to look at from kind of all of those angles. Do you see what I was getting at with that idea of resentment baked into psychotherapy?
Yeah, I really liked. I almost interrupted you because it caused me to have a kind of eureka moment because I had not thought of that before. But that's exactly right. I love reading Nietzsche. I love talking about Nietzsche. I think Nietzsche is extremely important. I am not, however, a Nietzschean, uh, be- because I mean I do have some fundamental disagreements with him, but uh, I also have some fundamental agreements with him, and I think that uh, his understanding of human psychology, uh, wherein resentment is the engine that moves it all. I think that's correct, and it had not even occurred to me to link that concept of the motive force of resentment being what's at the foundation of so much of this therapeutic culture. Um, Now, I would be remiss, however, if I didn't just also simply say, uh, and this is something I've slowly been working on over the past couple of years. That there is a, a really good book. He's a very complicated thinker. Uh, is the author? His name is Philip Reef. Uh, some of your listeners might have heard of him. He's worth your time reading. He's very complicated, but he writes a book called, if I remember correctly, it's something like Therapeutic Culture or the Rise of Therapeutic Culture, and it is fundamentally grounded in a kind of he's grounded in a kind of Nietzschean understanding of things. But I mean, we don't even have to attach these fancy philosophical words to it. What we can simply say is that this the problem that occurs now. I don't want to be dismissive of this thing we call the unconscious, because there was good work done by Jung and by Freud, and by a number of the people that discussed the unconscious. Now, that's not to say that they themselves overall did good work. It's just to say some of the things they had to say were good. Um, so I don't want to dismiss them, but the problem with man, and I think this is human nature, is that we have a tendency to simply look for excuses. I mean, this is so biblical. Man always wants the easy way out, wants to slink his way out. And usually what that means is to be lazy, to make excuses. And when you provide an understanding of the self, and let's be perfectly clear here, that's what defines you, uh, in terms of the responsibilities that you have as a human. If you provide ways of understanding that thing that allow an enormous amount of exculpatory evidence of things that you might not have any control over, uh, then it could be the case that people simply use it as an excuse. One of the things that's kind of funny about the dynamics between men and women is that very often when men get sick, they sort of fall back on, their wife or their girlfriend, and are like, oh babe, just take care of me, something like that. Um, it's, oh, I'm so sick, you know what I mean? When we know that we could still very well get up and go ahead and cook breakfast for ourselves, or what have you, or something. Um, and so that element writ large across the entirety of political community, as it is today, and make no mistake about it, it is, um, that becomes a very, very easy and extremely seductive way that everyone can just have a wholesale lack of responsibility, because there's always an excuse at hand. Someone can start crying and simply say, it's like, well, for whatever, right? My family, just all this kind of stuff. And it's precisely because, I mean, to even call it therapeutic culture, I would say, is a euphemism. We're talking about the rise of effeminacy. Uh, that's a problem. That is a very big problem, because there's virtue, there's enormous virtue uh, in saying yes. I've had a rough life. I've made bad decisions on my own. I've things are just not always well. But you know what? I still get up, and I do the business that needs to be done, because I have to provide not just for my family, but I have to provide for myself. I can't close my eyes while I'm shaving, right? I have to look myself in the mirror. And all of us know in our heart of hearts, if we're putting everything forward that we've got and doing our best, or if we might in fact just be kind of half-assing it, making excuses, and we could have tried harder. And so I think that's the great danger of this therapeutic culture that we live in. And especially, again, I mean, I just can't emphasize enough just the enormity of the uh, big pharma with their mental health drugs, the antidepressants and things like that, the Ambiens, and, well, not the Ambiens, but the Xanaxes and things like that. I mean, these are the most prescribed medications by far. I mean, they blow everything else out of the water. Uh, and so all that does is it just punts the ball, because there might be issues that you need to get control of, right? That you have, and you have the ability to get control of them, uh, but you're taking the easy way out. And what we're talking about here with the self is that a serious understanding of what we ourselves are, that is not just a way out of so much of this, it's a virtuous way out of it. And in fact, uh, I think this is reflected in everyone's common interest in psychology, is that it doesn't have to be a painful way out, right? I mean, it's not going to be pleasant always, but you see yourself becoming better. Uh, and that alone is, I mean, it's sort of like the gym. Once you start to see the results, then they become addictive in themselves. You think, oh my gosh, now I realize I can do this now. And so I wonder what else I can do, right? I've been holding myself back. I've been my own worst enemy on these things, and I'm not anymore. So onward and upward. What else can I accomplish now? And that sense of accomplishment is one of the greatest feelings in life, and it's right there for us. We just have to make that initial step, uh, turn away from the excuses, whether they're justified or not. That's the key, right? I mean, it's one thing to say it's an excuse, but it's something else entirely to say, yes, you know what, it's a justified excuse, but it doesn't matter. I'm going to do it anyway. Uh, I think we all, or hopefully we all, have at least one friend like that, and we look up to them and say, you know what, I need to be better. I need to be like that. So,
It's interesting because within all of this, right, is the question of the origin of evil or sin or corruption, whatever you want to say that, right? And I hate this term, not in and of itself, but because people who are not very smart use it all the time, right? And that is Gnostic, right? And genuinely, when we talk about Gnosticism, we have this idea of this a completely separate spiritual and physical world, right? The physical world is corrupt. The spiritual world is kind of one of form. It's perfect. I'm hyper simplifying. Bear with me. And it's interesting, right? Because within that idea of self knowledge, when you look at ideas like the Jungian child, for instance, which is quite popular among like the current instantiation of like bedroom feminists, right? Not particularly serious people, but nonetheless, it's in the culture. And what effectively that is sort of a repackaged version of the noble savage, right? That there is a true self within inside of you that is, without corruption, that is perfect. Maybe not exactly in that language. But when we talk about, self-knowledge, right? Having a friend to, sort of reflect, that sort of soul back at you. That is where there is that opportunity for seeing those genuine flaws within yourself. And I think that it again, it's interesting because that kind of premise of the noble savage, the Jungian inner child, whatever you want to call it, seems almost innocuous or pointless on first viewing. But buried within that is this sort of idea that the truest version of yourself, that exists inside of you is basically perfect, right? And I think that's sort of a poison pill. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, definitely. I think that also speaks to similar to what I was saying in the sense that uh, we have a tendency to take something that for all for practical intents and purposes, I mean, it is possibly extremely helpful, but we have a tendency to dilute that or appropriate it, right? To make it our own in a way that it wasn't necessarily intended. But I tend to side with you on this, though. At least what I think you're getting at here is that I myself, I don't even like the this when I recognize that there are seeds to something that can grow into a weed. I don't want really anything to do with it at all. So when you say, for instance, like the Jungian child and stuff, that's I sometimes have a bad habit of being dismissive to schools of thought that I just don't think. I think it's not so much that I think they're wrong. I just think that there are more rich and deeper schools of thought that one could spend one's time learning about as opposed to that. But I do have a number of friends who really appreciate Jung, and I'm friends with them, and out of respect, just for them and what they found in Jung. I don't want to, trash them or anything, but I just have ended up avoiding Jung and stuff, and I just have always spent my time with Nietzsche instead. So
Fair enough there. So one of the distinctions that we've made before, or that we've talked through, right, is this distinction between kind of like soul, psyche, and consciousness. What do you think that shift in term means, and how is that, I guess, denial of the self characterized in current philosophy?
I have to be. This is funny. I hope he listens to this. So my dear friend Alejandro, he's far more sober in these things than I am because I just have that fight in me, right? I love jumping into the fray and using this life that I've spent learning to really take it to the enemy, right? But Alejandro is much more sober, and he got frustrated with me when I was talking about the denial of the self because he's like, no, no, no. He's like, look, he's like Locke and Hume. I mean, they don't deny the self. They just have their understanding of it is just very thin. And of course, he's right. But uh, when and same for Nietzsche, I had some academic guy that he was commenting on the space I did, where I put the self. I titled it Greek Tragedy and the Self, where I put the self in quotation marks. And he's like, why is that in quotation marks? And I was like, well, because it's not at all clear that there is such a thing. And he was like, so you're saying Nietzsche denies the self? And I was like, well, yeah. And he said, that's not true, right? And he immediately starts, and I was like, well, listen to the space where I go into details about it. And he's like, I just don't got time for that. But I'm just, maybe you should read my book about it. And I was like, no, I'm not going to. If you can't even listen to a space, there's no way I'm going to read your book. But it's not so much so I have to be careful here. It's not a denial of the self. What it is that they simply can't find the link that unifies the self. So in other words, it's probably a better way to say it would be that there's not a unity to the self. It's a plurality. Um, and then with this plurality, uh, and not being able to find any consensus about whatever it is, then you have the rise of the unconscious. But and there's also, by the way, there's a very, very famous book. It's like 500 or 600 pages called, I think, The Rise of the Unconsciousness. Very popular. A lot of people love it. It's written by a student of psychology who's kind of a historian. And the only reason I point this out is because a lot of your listeners who are going to want to maybe look into this will cross paths with it. Let me just simply say that there are a number of flaws in that book. Historians rarely get philosophers right, just like they rarely get theologians right. Um, but okay, uh, here's going back to your question about consciousness and psyche. What happens is the following. Locke does not want to use the word soul. What has happened over the entirety of the medieval period is that uh, philosophy has become the handmaiden of theology. So what happens, the culmination of this is that I guess what we would call free thinkers, but really just other philosophers, are end up getting censored by the church because their inquiry into the fundamental questions does not match up with biblical teaching, and so they end up being persecuted. And so the slingshot recoils, and what the philosophers end up having to do is diminishing the role of Christianity in their thought in total because they want to push back now. So Locke does not want to use the word soul because it brings with it the uh, baggage of the Christian tradition. And so what he uses instead is the word conscious. And so this is one of those defining moments in Western philosophy where something new comes onto the scene and it replaces something old but very important. So where we talk about, for instance, the etymology of the word, psychology meaning a logos of the psyche, and psyche is just, it means soul. So a logos of the soul. That ends up being a logos of conscious, because conscious is, I liked that phrase you used earlier, morally neutral. It's, in other words, it's theologically neutral. Doesn't have anything to do necessarily at all with the afterlife or religion or anything. So that's going to be what happens. And then once you've gotten soul out of the way, which is to say, once you've gotten the indications of Christianity entirely out of the way, then they're off and running. And so then you have the rise of the consciousness. And that brings us all the way up to today with so many of these contemporary philosophers and commentators. Thinking of some of the more popular being guys like Daniel Dennett. Uh, they will have entire books about this called things like, the philosophy of consciousness. or what is consciousness, right? All of these things that define in many ways this whole debate of artificial intelligence, right? When do machines become conscious? Well, that would have been understood prior to the moderns and Locke as asking, well, when do machines get souls? And so you see right away, you're like, wait a minute, uh, I don't think they can. But that's going to take us into sort of the the edge, the cutting edge of modern science and stuff like that. But that's the key thing to keep in mind here. This is when our words matter. Uh, we have to understand what gets lost in this transition to speaking only of consciousness as opposed to soul, because the effect, the long-term effect, uh, I mean, this is like George Orwell, right? Changing words, right? The consequences of changing words are enormous, because now all of a sudden, if you can talk about the inner life of man as his conscious, and offer specialties and majors and write books about it that have absolutely no reference to what used to be understood as being part of the Christian tradition, then you have a slow falling away of people realizing just how much the Christian tradition itself might be able to add to the conversation. And so you'll hear people talk about this thing called secularization, the way in which an entire people just falls away from its religious roots. That's what's happened with this rise of the word consciousness having replaced the word soul. Because again, and let me just be clear here, use of the word soul does not necessarily mean that you are talking about anything of the biblical tradition. Uh, Suke or psyche in Greek just meant uh, that part of the human that was responsible for two things: motion and cognitive awareness. That's it. There were no indications of anything with the afterlife or anything like that. Uh, Now that changes with the rise of Christianity. Uh, so we can still talk about soul today. Nietzsche uses the word soul, Seele, throughout his writings, but of course Nietzsche doesn't believe in anything after this life. So it's possible. So it doesn't necessarily have to imply that. But what it does do is it at least holds out the possibility that it could be there, right? So, I mean, if you're talking about the soul, it does carry the valence of possible discussion of your spiritual life. Not so much when all you're doing is talking about consciousness, and that's something that's very, very important, I think, because what it is it's a diminished horizon. Uh, you've you've made your horizon smaller now because you've included a word that doesn't have the valence of the word that it replaced, which would have expanded it. And so again, I mean, I'm not really in the business of proselytizing, but I am in the business of making people aware of how it is the case that, and this is very important, the field of psychology is just about the most corrupt as far as what we would call the left as you can get. The field of psychology is precisely why it is that we can have transgenders, right? Because these people have to get psychological approval. And so psychology is the field of the woke. It has been the field of the woke for a long time. And so if you want to understand precisely how it is that we as a people can have lost contact with our spiritual roots, and I really don't like that word spiritual. uh, I like to, I don't even like the word religion. I like to say, well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about Christianity? Are we talking about Judaism? Or what are we talking? So if you want to understand how it is that we as a people have lost contact with our Christian origins, uh, just simply ask yourself, well, as a people, how dependent upon the psychologists are we? Because there's the answer. And so that gets us back to that discussion of the pharmaceutical drugs and stuff like that. But anyway, I hope that was a bit of an answer to your question. I know I didn't address the Gnosticism stuff, but I do have plenty to say about that if you want to. go that
Sure,
way.
and I'm happy to hear that. Just two quick things about that. One of the assumptions that almost always needs to be examined is the assumption of neutrality, right? So you're right to bring up that idea of when you accept a word, you are sort of accepting its frame. And the move from soul to consciousness is changing the frame of that discussion. You bring up Freud, right? We talked about him often, and he was very explicit about that, right? I don't want to get too far afield, but Libido Dominandi by Jones, I've referenced before, has a chapter on this, right? Which is what did Freud see himself as doing, and he very consciously went about adjusting the Christian and Western frame. For the sake of my YouTube channel, I will probably leave that discussion there. But I'm curious. You said you had something to add on the idea of Gnosticism.
Yeah, well, this is what I like to say. This is how it was explained to me. I mean, you're certainly right. The word itself is misused, um, but uh, this is helpful for people to understand just as a broad overview our tradition as a people. Um, you have the tradition on the one hand, the philosophic tradition of logos. Uh, you've got the Greek version with Plato, etc., and then you've got the biblical version, right, the Book of John. And then, now those two are not the same, by the way. It's going to turn out that the biblical understanding of logos uh, has some relationship to this. I'm going to use quotation marks, right? Gnosticism, right? So you have the tradition of the logos. That's where we get things like science and everything like that. And then you have the other fundamental tradition in the West. And that's the tradition, and the way my just amazing professor described it to us once is he said it's the tradition that shatters all logoi, right? In other words, all arguments, all reason. And that's the tradition of Gnosticism. And so the more appropriate word uh, that most people mean when they say Gnosticism is Hermeticism. Uh, the Hermetic tradition that was understood to be the kind of mystical tradition. But that's going to be the two pillars, as it were. So with this thing that we call the self, uh, what you're going to get is, I mean, and this gets just absolutely fascinating. This is an entire series of shows on its own. The influence of the mystics or the Hermetic tradition in the West, uh, because it was so overpowered by the rise of science, which itself was the tradition of the logos. Uh, and just keep in mind, right? Psychology means giving a logos of the psyche, a logos of the soul. Well, what if it's the case that you can't give it a logos, but you can have these flashes of insight about it? It's just ineffable, right? I mean, you can't really describe in the scientific way that we would recognize today. And this is going to be, for instance, the road that Jung is going to go down, as opposed to what we get more of an emphasis on with Freud, which is being able to attach much more solidly a kind of logos to it. So you have that those two divergences, as it were, um, on this question of the self in this field of psychology. And Nietzsche is going to be much more in the camp, for instance, of Jung than in Freud. Now, I don't think that Nietzsche would have agreed in any way with Jung, but with Nietzsche, what we have is that the self, there is such a thing, but it's just what we do is we provide reason after the fact. It's just these various drives in us, these quanta of power exerting themselves from one moment to the next. And what we do with logos is just always after the fact, right? We're always rationalizing away whatever it was that we really don't fully have access to. And this leads to interesting. Nietzsche's understanding of the self is quite fascinating because he denies free will uh, because there's a sense of the unconscious there. That's where Freud and Jung both get the unconscious from. But at the same time, he does recognize that there's some elbow room there. And the imagery that Nietzsche uses is that of horticulture. So the same way that you would have, for instance, like a little bonsai tree that you could trim and shape however you want. That's essentially going to be the self, according to Nietzsche, is that uh, the self is, the little tree. We don't really know much about it, its inner workings or anything, but we can still trim it up a little bit to sort of fashion it in the ways that we want to. But anyway, that's just, I just wanted to add that there on the element of Gnosticism, and it goes back much further. By the way, it has some late medieval roots that really come through and really have an important role in what becomes of German idealism, which is fascinating because one wants to claim, for instance, that someone like Hegel or Fichte or even Schelling, all of these German idealists, that they're these just, it's like reason on steroids. But it turns out that it's not at all that neatly categorized, because they were extremely influenced by a tradition in Germany of mystics, David Bohm, and a number of other people. So, but anyway, I'll just leave that there, though.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because I'd have a specific thinker to bring up, but I've read enough elite theory that they all sort of run together. But there's a similar idea. It might be Mosca now that I say it, but with the idea of political formulas, right? That it effectively is a after the fact justification for rule, right? So, well, I'm in charge, so I guess we'll decide that my dad was the son, and that's why I'm in charge. Or I'm in charge, so it was the will of the revolution, or something like that. And obviously, that's a different field, perhaps. But I think it's interesting that that idea seems to kind of jump across disciplines, I guess.
Yeah, I'd have to think about that a little bit more.
Oh, of course.
Um,
Sorry, I just
yeah.
completely pulled that out
No,
of
no,
nowhere.
no, you're good. I just would have to think about that a little bit more because I have to confess, I was trying to make sure I was remembering the right Bohm that I was talking about while you were talking, because there's a
Well,
couple of them. There's a later German Bohm who's involved in quantum mechanics, and then there's the late medieval Bohm who was the mystic.
well, look, I'll put it this way. I will never be one to get on you for not remembering your sources because I don't know if I have ever correctly sourced an argument I have used on this show. And so who am I to be picky? But anyway, man, we are coming up on time. If people want to find more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
So I have a website. It's athenscorner.com, and that's where I provide the vast majority. That's my primary work, with various series that I'm doing in the great books. I have a science and technology series. I have a series for fathers and sons. That's my favorite. I have a series for Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Now, I also have a series for American Studies. I just haven't gotten it off the ground yet because it's the website is still so new. But if people are interested in American Studies, that's where a lot of my passion really resides, because I like tracing down the tradition of the influence of philosophy into the role of our identity as a people in America. particularly as it shows itself in the kind of democratization of Christianity and how it is that we can end up with things like transgender flags in churches in America, things like that. But anyway, a lot of work going on there. Now I also have them, I have a few free like I just put out a 4-hour discussion on Thucydides. I've got a 3-hour discussion on Homer. Those are on Spotify and Apple, various podcast platforms. It's just you can find me at Athens Corner. That's the handle on those things. So yeah.
Well, great work. And I will say I've been going through your backlog, and this is a backhanded compliment if I've ever given one. It's very difficult to listen to your work for a long amount of time. Not that it's not entertaining, it's not good. It's just so incredibly dense. And so I'll sort of find myself an hour in just needing to stop and circle back later. And
But
I've really been enjoying it.
well, that's the problem. See, and this is what I tell people. This is what's funny. It takes me about 4 weeks of editing, and we're talking 5 to 6 hours a day of editing to make those longer discussions, the ones that are like 3 and 4 hours. And the reason that I do that is because I don't want to waste the listener's time. I don't want anyone who listens to even a minute of what I've put out, recorded, or on my website. I don't want them to think, oh, that was time wasted, or yeah, whatever. No, I want every single moment to count, and so I make them that dense because I want to make sure I'm not wasting other people's times. But then it ends up producing exactly like what you're saying. That's the danger, is that it's like, whoa, wait a minute, that was a lot that just got said in that 1 or 2 minute there. But that's good though, I think, because what I make these things for is I'm hoping that people who either, they didn't get to study philosophy when they wanted to in school, or perhaps those who want to study philosophy but don't want to be corrupted by all of the nonsense going on in academia, can find it at its highest level with what me and some of my friends are putting out there. So it's like it's a tough needle to thread. But yeah, I feel your pain on that, because I've had those same experiences when I listen to some of the guys that I consider to be my teachers talking about philosophy, because it's like, hold on, let me catch up. So
Right. I've had the feeling of, I'm driving down the road, with a podcast, and I'm like, oh, I should be taking notes, right? Which is not incredibly conducive to driving, but speaks to the quality of the work nonetheless. But again, man, thank you so much. This was a great episode.
yeah, look, man, it's always such an honor when you have me on, and I just can't thank you enough. I really, really appreciate it. So thank you so much, my friend.
As far as my stuff, you can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a Substack. And if you want to support us more directly, the best way to do that is head over to Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. One of the few products I've actually recommended to my IRL friends. And yeah, that's a funny dynamic, right? They're like, wait, this is sponsored on your podcast? I'm like, yes, it is, in fact. And JD, the guy who runs it, solid guy, talk with him a lot. And again, everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.